that attack. So that has to be recognized. It so happens that if you that you could only sell stocks short, and there was a rule which didn't allow sales except on an uptick, which was an effective way of preventing bear raids.
Right.
Now, so that was abolished, and that opened the way for bear raids on the stock. And CDS are particularly effective for bear raiding bonds. And since the cost of borrowing is an essential part of the business model of a financial institution, if its cost of borrowing is driven up, it actually becomes insolvent.
Right.
And that is what has happened. Now, recognizing this, I don't think that CDS should be allowed to be freely bought and sold by people who don't have a legitimate insurable interest in the bonds. And even if they do, the amount of insurance that they can buy should not exceed the amount of interest they have in the bonds. Because, for instance, Abitibi Water, one of the largest paper companies, actually went into bankruptcy because the people who owned the bonds had a bigger benefit from it going
right.
Bankrupt than settling. So it's a very dangerous instrument, and it should be used, as I say, only in a limited way.
But of course, neither the United States nor London or Europe or pretty much anywhere else in the world is suggesting that we do anything that radical.
Well, Germany, in fact, Angela Merkel, the problem that Mr. Soros identifies is now being played out in the sovereign debt crisis. And first of all, the sovereign debt crisis is a crisis because the investment banks, Goldman especially, sold to Greece so-called cross-currency swaps that were devised in a way that masked Greece's debt so it could gain entry into the European Union. This is in the early 2000s. In 2007, when Papandreou came into office, he said, guess what? You know, when you take away these cross-currency swaps, our sovereign debt is double what the world thinks it is. People said, oh, that may be a problem elsewhere. And in fact, it was a problem elsewhere. Well, when these countries then became in jeopardy of default, the Goldmans of this world started selling naked credit default swaps on sovereign debt. That is to say, you don't have to have a bond or have lent money to Greece. You can just bet. That's what Mr. Soros is talking about, needing an insurable interest. You can just bet that Greece is going to collapse. And if, by the way, Greece collapses, or any of these other southern European countries, the problem that we saw with Lehman and AIG of whether they have the capital to sustain the bets they made that say that Greece and Italy and Portugal will succeed, whether the money will be there. Well, Angela Merkel was so angry about this. First of all, Germany's been called in to help in a bailout package as part of the European Union for Greece. Germany's not happy about that, but Angela Merkel banned the purchase of naked credit default swaps on sovereign debt by German citizens. And a lot of people think that, especially maybe some of you here who are in the industry think that's all crazy. But my view is, if one of these countries defaults, the banks who gave the insurance aren't going to have the capital to pay it. And the Angela Merkels of this world, especially in the European Union, are going to come alive. And rather than funneling these things into exchanges and clearing operations so they're transparent, you're going to have bans. And by the way, this legislation authorizes the SEC and the CFTC, upon certain findings, to ban credit default swaps.
George, I'm not too happy having Angela Merkel on the same side as I am.
Well,
but it can't be helped.
There's good news and bad news.
What do you think the possibility is that a Greece or some other country might default, and how worried should we be about the euro crisis in general?
Well, I think that eventually the Greek debt has to be restructured in an orderly manner because it's already in the price, and Greece would be ill-advised not to take advantage of it. But they can't restructure it as long as they have a primary deficit in their budget. In other words, Greece really exploited the opportunities for cheating, and Greek citizens ripped off the state on a very large scale. So you really do have a structural problem in Greece that needs to be handled, and defaulting or reorganizing the debt it would not help in doing that. This is a process that is currently underway, and when it has made progress and Greece reestablishes primary surplus, at that time it would be advisable to have a haircut or an orderly restructuring of the debt, because it will be by that time extremely heavy and probably would weigh the economy down for a very, very long time.
What are the prospects of, though, it spreading in a contagion-like fashion to Portugal, to Spain, to other vulnerable countries?
I think that the situation of Spain is very, very different, because there haven't been the abuses in Spain. Actually, Spain followed very sound budgetary principles, fiscal policy, has a lower debt to GDP ratio than Germany. So it's basically would be sound, except for the fact that they had a real estate bubble and a construction boom, which has collapsed, and they have now very heavy unemployment. And this is the time when you should be effectively stimulating the economy by running up additional borrowing. However, the money is not available because the banking system in Europe is in extremely bad shape.
Worse than ours, much worse than ours.
Much, much worse. And there is, in fact, a simmering banking crisis, which has now kind of almost surfaced in connection. It's called a sovereign credit crisis, but it's really a banking crisis. And it's a direct result of the introduction of the euro, because when the euro was introduced, you didn't have a common fiscal policy, but you only had a common central bank. But the central bank, the ECB, was willing to accept the debt of each of the member countries on equal terms. And you could repo them, so you could borrow again, and they were considered to be riskless. So you didn't have to apportion any of your equity capital to buy the bonds and repo them. And as a result, the banks bought particularly those government bonds which yielded more than Germany, and repoed them. And that brought